Okie dokie. So we're going to get this shir kicked off, and it's obviously been kindly sponsored the Eloi Nishmas for the elevation of the soul of Yerucham ben Moshe, the late Jeremy Cass. So all learning and blessings that we're going to make today are going to be for the elevation of his soul. And we have a really interesting talk, or piece of Gemara tonight. We're going to look at basically the laws of squeezing things on Yom Tov, and this has quite far-reaching ramifications till this day. So we have Martin coming in over here. Just to summarize what we've been doing so far. Just to summarize what we've been doing. Just to summarize what we've been doing so far. We have had a dispute in the Mishnah right at the beginning between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about an egg that got laid on Yom Tov, an egg that was laid on Yom Tov. And Beis Hillel say you're not allowed to eat the egg on Yom Tov, and Beis Shammai say you are allowed to eat that egg on Yom Tov. Now we've had 3 suggestions so far, what exactly they're arguing about. The first suggestion we had was Rav Nachman, who said they're probably arguing about muktzah. This egg hasn't had a dedicated function before Yom Tov came in, and therefore that could be what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing about. Is this egg considered to have had a function attached to it before it came into the world or not? I forgot to tell you this story. I thought I'd mention it now. My Rabbi Berkowitz, he said that there was this incident of a fella who one Friday evening came home to broken plates all over the entire flat. This was in Israel. And apparently one of his kids had decided to go through the cupboards and just whip out every single plate. And they were all smashed all over the floor. Now, this fellow had other plates, but they were his Pesach plates. Now, the question is, are his Pesach plates muktzah on Shabbos? Bearing in mind that what he's eating this Shabbos is chometz. He'd never used these plates on a normal Shabbos. They're reserved exclusively for Pesach. So are these plates going to be muktzah? And as far as I remember, the ruling given was they are not muktzah, and this fella is allowed to take his plates from the Pesach cupboard and use them on Shabbos. There's nothing actually stopping him using these plates on a normal Shabbos. Obviously, he will have to go through some difficulties to make them ready again for Pesach, but ultimately there's nothing wrong with that. So they are deemed to have a function on Shabbos. It's just not a typical one. Anyway, that was muktzah. That was the first talk. And we decided that we probably aren't going to be using this suggestion of this egg being muktzah, because if we're talking about a case of muktzah, we should really be talking about the chicken as well. The chicken itself is also muktzah, not just the egg. That was suggestion number 1. Then we had suggestion number 2, which was Rabbi, and we were saying maybe it's a problem of hachana, preparation. We spoke last week at great length about how you can't use Yom Tov to prepare for Shabbos, or Shabbos to prepare for Yom Tov. So if you have this egg which has been formed over the Shabbos, when it's born on Yom Tov, which is the case we're talking about, where we have a Yom Tov after Shabbos, if it was born on the Yom Tov on Sunday, we'll have potentially have used Shabbos to create this egg. So Beis Shammai would say, yes, this is a problem of preparation. This egg has been prepared on Shabbos. It's not respectful for Shabbos to prepare on Shabbos for Yom Tov, and that would be a problem. And Beis Shammai would say, no, this egg is permitted because that's not really considered preparation. After all, you didn't do anything. It was just the chicken's process. Then we had the third suggestion about what this argument Beis Shammai Beis Hillel about this egg could be, and that was Rabbi Yosef. And Rabbi Yosef says that maybe it's a decree lest one come to eat fruits that have fallen off a tree. So just like you have, let's think of the chicken as the egg tree. So if this chicken were to lay an egg, you might then say that just as I can eat this egg, I could also eat a fruit that had fallen off a tree. And we say, no, you're not allowed to eat fruits that had fallen off a tree, because once you start eating fruits from the ground, you might come to eat fruits from the tree itself and be violating the prohibition of harvesting by taking the fruit off the tree. So that itself is a potential answer as to what Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are arguing. Beis Shammai, who say that this is permitted, say no, there's no real correlation between fruit and eggs, and there's no danger that if we let someone eat eggs, they're going to come to eat fruit on the ground. And Beis Hillel would say no, there is a concern that we're going to view this egg as having been as having fallen off its egg tree, and once you can have egg from the egg tree, you can have fruit from the fruit tree. This brings us to our 4th suggestion about what Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argue at, and this is Rabbi Yitzchak. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak, he says, if you've got your art scroll sheets, let's do about 4 words of Gemara before you need to explain things. It's midway down the first column on the first page over there. So it's the paragraph that begins, the Gemara cites a 4th explanation of the Mishnah, and this is Rabbi Yitzchak Omar. Rabbi Yitzchak says that what this dispute Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is, that focuses on the egg, but is ultimately part of, this dispute is part of a decree, Mishum Mashkin Shezovin, which is juices that flowed from a fruit on Yom Tov. Now, what is this issue of fruit juice that comes out of the fruit on a Shabbos or a Yom Tov? Now, there is one of the 39 primary works that are forbidden on Shabbos or Yom Tov is called dosh, which means threshing. Threshing was a way that they would get materials to build the Mishkan, so things like dyes, which were harvested from plants, or any other things that they would use, they would often do a work process that was similar to threshing. Now, threshing, if we think about it, is removing the desired product from the undesired product. So if you think of, let's say, the typical fashion of wheat, so you have the husk of the wheat, and you want to take out the kernel from the husk. That's achieved through threshing. Now, derivatives of this threshing prohibition are called mefarik. Mefarik literally means to unload, but it's the process by which you take anything desired food-wise from anything undesired. So one example would be potentially shelling pistachios. That might be a prohibition. Disclaimer, it's not, but shelling pistachios would be an example of how you take something desired for something undesired. Now, this is also applied to fruits and fruit juice. So if you were to squeeze an orange on Shabbos or Yom Tov for its juice, that is prohibited as it's a derivative of threshing. Again, you're taking something from inside something else, the desired product from inside the undesired product. Now, just to put this makes a difference. You have to be aware of this, that this malacha, this work process is defined as separating something into 2 distinct parts. This is very important because we're going to go through 5 examples of mefarik today, squeezing, threshing, or just separating 2 things into distinct parts today. And we're going to explain, quickly how this plays out. So number 1 example, we're going to do squeezing fruit for the juice. You get these orange juice presses, which are remarkably inefficient. You need 7 oranges to get a cup of oranges. You get those things, you squeeze your orange. That is definitely prohibited on Shabbos or Yom Tov. That's squeezing. It's like threshing. That's going to be a problem. But let's say you were to take...
Well, you have to do it. Sounds like that's interesting.
Boom, Reuven, with the money. Call this guy Rabbi for a few minutes. Reuven has preempted my second case. So case number 1 was just, so squeezing an orange for its juice, definitely a problem. However, Reuven has correctly pointed out that if you were to squeeze this, let's say a lemon, onto a piece of fish or a salad, that would be okay. Now, this falls back into a very careful definition that we've just said above. You have to separate something into 2 distinct parts. So when you squeeze an orange for its juice, you're separating the juice from the orange. Those are 2 distinct parts. That's food, if you want to call it food, and drink. When you squeeze a lemon into a salad, for example, at no point does this juice become a distinct and separate entity of its own. In the words of the Gemara and the Halacha, it's referred to as just putting food into food. It's almost like, for example, if you were to sprinkle salt on your salad, that would be fine, right? Because it's just food into food. It's not the best example, but you're just putting food into food. So this lemon has at no point had the juice distinct from it. It just basically goes straight from the lemon into the juice. A very extreme example. Are you allowed to eat an orange on Shabbos? Obviously you are. Oh, but when you bite into it, you're squeezing the juices from the orange. Why isn't that going to be a case of mefarik? And obviously the answer is because it at no point becomes distinct. At no point does it become, a clear 2 distinct entities in order for it to violate the prohibition of threshing.
So, but what about peeling the orange? Are you allowed to?
Peeling the orange is allowed. It's part of a different discussion about boirer. And the reason why you're allowed to peel an orange is that it's just called how you eat the orange. It's just called eating. So that wouldn't be, but it's found that, yeah, it's not really part of the Mefarik, it's part of Boirer, but you're right. Yeah, but it's Eichel and it's Psolis. It's food and it's undesired stuff. So we'll get to Boirer maybe one day. Yes.
It's not because it's oranges versus lemons, is it? Because if you were to squeeze some lemon juice onto a lemon drizzle cake,
Yes.
that'd be okay.
That would also be
Because it's
okay.
food in food.
Exactly.
You could equally squeeze an orange onto orange cake.
100%. Yes.
Or
The problem is when you collect the juices
collect the juice.
and
yeah.
then you have two distinct entities. You have the orange and then you have
Yeah.
the juice. That's akin to harvesting. Yes, Cedric.
If that's the case, if you can squeeze a lemon off your salad, can you crush peppercorns onto your food?
Very good point. The answer is you probably can't, but there's a different problem of grinding. Grinding is a separate issue. But in terms of mefarik, in terms of what we're talking about now, that would not be a problem because you're not separating the pepper into two distinct entities. You're just making them smaller particles of pepper. So that's not considered separating one desired product from the undesired product.
So you could squeeze lemon juice into olive oil.
Probably yes. Yeah. Why would you do that?
To make a dressing.
Oh, right. Yes. So I know. Right? Yeah. Yes, Juliet.
Let's go back on Sephardic, and that's the chili on everything.
Yeah.
When that person chops the chili, is that a problem because they're de-seeding the chili onto the Ashkenazi food?
So, wait, so they have a chili pepper.
They have a chili, red chili pepper,
Yeah.
and then they chop it, but then the seeds sometimes come out, so they're sort of separating. Because you don't eat the seeds, you
Right.
eat the chili pepper.
Whatever the answer is, just say yes, but Shalom Bar.
Yeah.
What is it? Again, it's a different conversation. It's more boirer. It's more selecting good from bad.
It's not.
Would that person normally eat the chili?
Yeah.
Seeds anyway, or do they not really seeds?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, if you eat the seed, that's fine.
But you should. Is there anything where you can remove the seeds, but you take out some of
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. These is all a completely different discussion about sorting. Yeah, this is all very relevant to sorting the malacha of boirer. And right now, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a very similar case, but different, called mefarik, which is not sorting, it's actually harvesting. So that's that. So we've done squeezing the fruit for the juice, which is definitely a problem. And we've had lemons into salads or fish, which is okay. Now, this is where we're going to get to the crazy end of mefarik. So toothbrushes. Toothbrushes on Shabbos have potential to be problematic, in as much as if you are to wet your toothbrush under the tap before you use it, when you apply the toothbrush or you use the toothbrush in your mouth, you are essentially squeezing the water from the brushes. That might be an issue. And based on this, it is definitely best practice to try and use a dry toothbrush before you put it in your mouth. So what I'll do is I'll use mouthwash. So first I'll put the mouthwash in my mouth and then I'll put the toothbrush into my mouth. On Shabbos, that is definitely preferable, or Yom Tov is definitely preferable, so you avoid squeezing the bristles.
I thought there's one was squeezing the toothpaste, that's why
Yeah.
don't use it.
Toothpaste is a different issue, which I didn't want to go into because it is very complicated.
Yeah.
There are those who scream blue in the face that it's a problem, and there are those who scream till they're purple in the face that it's okay. So you have to check with your local competent Orthodox rabbi, and then he'll probably refer you to Rabbi Feldman. So about toothpaste, I'm not going to comment. Personally, I use mouthwash is definitely a simpler option.
Mouthwash in your mouth and then put your toothbrush.
Is definitely ideal and it's not as hard as you think. Right, so that's the third case, which could be problematic.
Don't do it first time.
Yeah. It needs a bit of practice. So maybe wear your pajamas the first few times, and yes, not because you're squeezing the bristle.
You just said it was okay to eat an orange because if as you bite into the orange, you're not
No.
Right, I think
there's a distinction between those two.
okay.
Those Shabbos toothbrushes, you get a rubber
Right, 100%. So yeah, so the Shabbos toothbrushes, which you're right, Richard, there is a market for Shabbos toothbrushes. Don't always solve the issue, by the way. I have not much faith in any of the Shabbos toothbrushes because the litmus test is if you can hold it, with the bristles facing down and it will contain water, then that's a problem already. Now, a lot of these Shabbos toothbrushes, they're designed to have their bristles far apart enough that they don't actually hold any water by themselves. I'm not convinced that they've actually solved much of the issue.
So it's not about the water being absorbed into them in that the
Correct.
bristles are made of.
Exactly.
It's
It's just they
the
hold
hazardous
the water.
container.
Exactly. Right. Again, I think there are grounds also to be lenient, like Martin said, but Moshe Feinstein definitely says this is definitely best practice. Okie dokie. The fourth case is very wet clothing, towels, and napkins. If something is sodden to the extent that whenever you move it, it's going to start, you're going to end up squeezing the clothing, that's going to be a problem. And it also applies if anyone is showering or washing over Shabbos or Yom Tov, they should make sure not to get their hair wet because you end up, or if they do get it wet, they should only dab it very lightly with a towel to avoid squeezing the hair. And the fifth case, which is probably my favorite, is milking cows. Milking cows also carries this problem of mefarek. Sorry?
Don't have the issue golden.
Right.
You can see now you're looking bushier in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Edgware. It's not that much more urban than this. Yeah. And Israel, it's a massive issue.
Yeah.
And the permitted, you'll find that farmers do all milk their cows on Shabbos, and there's stories of people in kibbutzim who get up 6 o'clock in the morning on Yom Kippur, and their first job on Yom Kippur is to milk the cows. And the reason for it is because it's very painful for cows not to get milked. So you've got to milk the cows because of Tsar Balei Chaim. That's a biblical requirement. You don't cause pain to animals, but that milk is not allowed to be used. I spent way too much time watching cow milking videos, and the technology in cow milking is mind-blowing. They now have this system where you don't actually need anyone to milk cows. Cows just approach the machine.
They know when to come in.
Yeah, the cows just sort of check in, they come in. It's unbelievable. And
no one is involved in it at all.
it's brilliant.
Yeah,
So you
connected
need not,
to the machine.
they just connect themselves to the machine milks them, and the cows walk out. It's brilliant. So, but this milk would have to be thrown away on
Trying to
Shabbos.
get teenagers to feed themselves the same way.
So these
It's
are,
difficult, they just can't do it.
You like our time back.
sorry?
But they've got a body sense when they know when to come in. So they all come in at the same time, and then I think it triggers some, sensor. I don't know how it works.
It's an amazing system, but you wouldn't even be allowed to really collect that milk, whether you use it or not. You can't even collect it. It has to be sort of either going straight onto the ground, or often they'll put soap or bleach in the buckets where the milk is collected so that it instantly becomes inedible. And then obviously on the Sunday milking, or whatever it is, milking resumes as usual. So this is just a brief look into the prohibition of squeezing on Yom Tov and Shabbos. So you can't squeeze orange juice for your oranges. You can squeeze lemon juice into food, or any orange juice into food, or anything else, or into olive oil, whatever it is. You can use a toothbrush, ideally put it into your mouth while it's still dry. Don't move very wet clothing, and you can milk cows. So let's go back into the Gemara. So let's bring this back into the relevance. Let's bring this back into our discussion. So we have Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak is saying that this dispute of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about about an egg that was born on Yom Tov is about whether we consider this egg in the same category as fruit juice on Yom Tov. That is essentially the discussion. So Beis Hillel, who say that you're not allowed to eat this egg, they are saying that just as you're not allowed to have juice from a fruit, you're also not allowed to have egg from a chicken. And Beis Shammai, who permit you to eat this egg, say there's no comparison. Fruit and juice are one thing, eggs and chickens are another thing. So Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, let's go back to that paragraph. We started. Rabbi Yitzchak says, Gezeiro mishum mashkin shezov. This dispute, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, is about whether the egg being laid by the chicken is akin to juices coming out of a fruit. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says to Rabbi Yitzchak, Mashkin shezovu, The whole reason why we said that juices that come from a fruit are prohibited on Shabbos and Yom Tov, Tamamai, what's the reason they're forbidden? There's a concern that if we allow you to eat the juices that drip out of the fruit, you may come to squeeze the fruit itself. And higufo gezerah. This itself, the reason the juices are prohibited is because you might come to squeeze the fruit. But anan nikum v'nigzo gezerah legezerah. We are going to make a prohibition, which is essentially a prohibition for a prohibition. So everyone who's here last week knows that we make a rabbinic prohibition. We only make one prohibition. So prohibition of the rabbinic institution protects us from a rabbinic prohibition, a biblical prohibition, sorry. But you can't have a rabbinical prohibition to safeguard a rabbinical prohibition, which itself is safeguarding a biblical prohibition. So what it seems like here we have is a prohibition of eggs, lest you come to have juices, lest you come to squeeze the fruit. So that is too many prohibitions, it's too many fences. We're not allowed to have the egg because you might come to have the juice. And then if you have the juice, you might come to transgress the biblical prohibition, of squeezing the fruit. So Rabbi says you can't have this institution, it's just too many prohibitions. So the Gemara answers, Kulo chada gezerahi. This is all really one institution, and it was made at the same time and in the same vein as the juices of the fruit. So we have this institution that's made this decree that we've said you're not allowed to have an egg from a chicken because it's similar to the fruits that have their juices coming out, and so you can't have eggs and juices because you might come to squeeze the fruit.
Both of them need to squeeze the fruit.
Exactly. Both of them essentially, as Reuben's quite rightly said, both of them essentially come to squeezing fruits.
It's
The
not
analogy
like
between
squeezing chickens, you're not gonna squeeze.
We're going to come into this, yeah, exactly. So we let's try and
So what
clarify
happens to
this.
this egg that was laid on Shabbos,
You just wait till after Shabbos and you can have it.
and you can eat it?
Yeah, you just can't eat it on that day.
Surely,
But then
surely.
why can't you drink the milk the next day? You're doing it yourself, no?
No, because the problem is you'll have already separated the milk from the cow.
Right.
So that is already the prohibition.
But the egg gets separated from the chicken.
Right, but you haven't separated it. You haven't
nature.
separated it.
Itself.
Yeah, and the same thing, if juice were to flow from an orange by itself, you'd be allowed to have that after
Yeah.
Yom Tov as well. If you were to squeeze it, you would.
So if the milking is complete, there is no person involved in it. Can you then keep the milk?
Meaning if
There
the
is no
milk
one but-
dripped from the cow by itself,
Or the
You
machine.
automated that the cow,
I
the cow
think,
triggered the milking machine rather than the human.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that the machine is still considered an extension of the person in
Right.
that sense. In that
That's
sense.
program.
For example, a lot of the older systems will have cow milking machines on timers. It is considered like us doing it.
Was there no concern about wasting food? Because you
Yes,
can
I was
imagine,
concerned
because
about that as well.
you can imagine that in Israel, hot country, eggs laid possibly in the morning, and it's then sitting there all day.
Yeah.
Wouldn't there have been some concern that it might go off,
Um,
and therefore you'd be wasting food in some way?
It appears not. It appears they weren't so concerned about this.
Yeah.
I mean, today it doesn't seem to be such an issue because the eggs are pretty sheltered in their environment. I don't think the
Yeah.
chicken's just baking there in the sun. But when we think about wasting food, we have to look at it as part of the religious picture. And so, you can't pick one religious element and just put it over something else. So one could almost go so far as say that's not considered wasting food.
Right,
That's not what we're going for. And you can have the egg obviously after Yom Tov.
Yeah.
So let's try and understand a bit more clearly what this link is between eggs and juices of fruit. So before we get there, we're just going to have a quick run through in the Gemara of all the opinions so far, and we're going to explain, who are our preferred options when it comes to the 4 suggestions of explaining the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So kulhu k'Rav Nachman lay omri. No one goes with Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman, who was our first suggestion that it's a case of muktzah, no one goes with that approach. Ki kushon, because we asked the question. Of, well, if we're talking about muktzah, we should be discussing the chicken much more than the egg. Karabonami layomri. And we also don't go like our second interpretation of Rabbi, which was about whether this is an issue of hachana or not. Because as the Gemara says, hachana leslehu. No one considers this an act of preparation. No one consider an egg being laid by a chicken on Sunday to have been prepared on Shabbos. Meaning, you, at the end of the day, you didn't do anything. So we're not going to take Rabbi's approach. Rabbi does consider that this egg being formulated on Shabbos is an act of preparation, even though it's not something that you're participating in. But he's a minority opinion, and generally speaking, that's not considered an act of preparation. So no one would have an issue with an egg that was born on a Sunday, which is Yom Tov, because of this reasoning, because of that rationale. Ella Rabbi Yosef, but this Rabbi Yosef, who we just mentioned last week, who says that this is a prohibition of, or a decree against potentially you eating fruit that had fallen from a tree. Why doesn't he agree, or what is his issue with Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding, which we've just mentioned, which is that this egg is part of the dispute or a part of the problem of fruit juices. So we have Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yosef, who said it's about fruit falling off trees. So fruit that's on the ground, you can't eat that. And he equates the egg to the fruit that's fallen off the tree. Rabbi Yitzchak says, no, it's not about fruit that's falling off a tree. It's about juices that have come from fruit. So what exactly do they feel is the problem with the other side? Why couldn't they agree on one phase or the other? What is prompting them to take these respective positions? So, Reb Yosef, who says that the egg being laid is akin to fruit falling off a tree, Beitzah uchla, upeirus uchla. An egg is food and fruit of food. La'afuke mashkin, and that is a step too far removed from juices. The lav uchla. Then they are not considered food. So Yosef says, I'll tell you why eggs are more similar to fruits being fallen off a tree. Because fruits that have fallen off a tree is food right in front of you. And eggs that have been laid is also food right in front of you. So there's not such a jump, or there's a perilous closeness between eggs that have been laid and fruits that have fallen off a tree. So he's going to say that this discussion of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is about whether you can have an egg that has been laid, because it is quite similar to a fruit that's fallen off a tree. They're both food sitting in front of you. But Rabbi Yitzchak, who we've just said, considers this to be an issue, or considers the egg to be similar to juices that have come from a fruit. Why does he take this particular approach? He will say to you that really an egg is more similar to juices than it is to apples that have fallen off a tree, because Beitzah belua, an egg was absorbed, it was an internal thing. Umashkin beluin, and juices of a fruit were also they were also internal, they were also absorbed by something else. La'afuke peirus de megalu v'kailu, to exclude fruit which had fallen off a tree, they were always external. They were never part of something else.
Yeah, the eggs are no love and the fruit is.
The eggs is, well, no, in that sense, in the literal sense, just like an egg was inside a chicken and came out, the juices were inside a fruit and came out.
Yeah, but the fruit was already there.
Right, so is the chicken. So Rabbi Yosef says that really this egg fits better into the prohibition of juices flowing from an apple or any other fruit, because the egg was inside, it was encapsulated by another body and has since become distinct. And this juice was also encapsulated by a fruit body and has since become distinct. So we can see it going both ways. On the one hand, we can say that eggs and apples are fruit, so therefore it's more akin to the prohibition of apples falling off a tree. On the other hand, we can say that no, the process by which they came to be in existence means that an egg is actually more similar to fruit juices. So that gives us two distinct opinions, Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yitzchak, as to what prohibition does this egg actually fall under. Now we're going to go into something that might be a bit confusing. It doesn't have to be. Right now, we've basically just established that we have Rabbi Yosef, who says that eggs are like apples falling off trees, and Rabbi Yitzchak, who says that no, eggs are actually like juices that come from fruit. We're now going to try and prove that Rabbi Yochanan, who we haven't seen until, we're going to try and prove that Rabbi Yochanan goes like Rabbi Yitzchak, that Rabbi Yochanan also approves of Rabbi Yitzchak's approach, which is that eggs are similar to juices that came from a fruit. And the way we're going to do this, with the way we're going to prove that Rabbi Yochanan thinks the same way as Rabbi Yitzchak, is he is going to bring a contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda. And from the way he phrases his question, the way he phrases his contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda's two statements, we're going to see that he understands that eggs are more similar to juices that have come from a fruit than they are to apples that have fallen off a tree. So we're going to try and prove that Rabbi Yochanan goes like Rabbi Yitzchak, and the way we're going to do that is by analyzing the way he phrases a question. So where are we in the article, Ruben?
Well,
Yes, where are that is the second page,
second paragraph.
second paragraph on the second page. So for Af Rabbi Yochanan, and also Rabbi Yochanan Sava, he maintains Gezerah Mishum Mashkin Shezavu. It's a prohibition against juices that flowed from a fruit. To Rabbi Yochanan, Rami, to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yochanan phrases a challenge on Rabbi Yehuda, Umeshani, and he answers it. Now, from the way he asks this question, we're going to see that he sees eggs as similar to juices that came from fruit. Tanan, we taught in a Mishnah. This is statement number 1 of Rabbi Yehuda. We taught in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to squeeze fruit to take out juices from them. But if these juices came out by themselves, asurin, nonetheless, these juices that even if you didn't squeeze them, they came out by themselves, are still prohibited. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, this is all our Mishnah that we're trying to analyze here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Im la'oichlin, if you bought these fruits in order to eat them, hayotze mehen mutter, the juices that came out of this apple that you bought to eat are allowed, because ultimately you want to eat this apple. You're not going to squeeze it. So if this apple is dedicated to eating purposes, any juices that came out, you'd be allowed to drink, because the concern, remember, is that you might come to squeeze this apple. But if this apple was never intended to be squeezed, it was only intended to be eaten, it would be okay. But if you bought this apple in order to make apple juice, any juices that came out of that apple, even by themselves, would be prohibited, because you might think that, oh, now's a good time to squeeze my apple. So any juices that flowed from a fruit that was bought in order to be squeezed, even if the juices came out by themselves, are prohibited. So this is the position of Rabbi Yehuda. So Alma, we see from Rabbi Yehuda's statement that Kol Eichlin le Rabbi Yehuda uchla de Efratu. We see from Rabbi Yehuda's statement that if you bought this apple to eat, any juice that came out of this apple gets the same status as the apple itself. And just like you're allowed to eat the apple, you're also allowed to eat the juice that came out of it. That's statement number 1. So Rabbi Yehuda says that any juice that comes from an apple that you're trying to eat is considered food of the apple, or it's just like a slice of the apple that's fallen off and you're allowed to eat that. So that's statement number 1 of Rabbi Yehuda. Now we're going to bring a statement of Rabbi Yehuda that contradicts this approach to juices coming from a fruit or something that stems from food being food itself. And we bring a contradiction to this statement of Rabbi Yehuda. V'oid Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda has said somewhere else, Matna Odom al Kalkula Shel Peres, which is a case we're not going to go into now. B'Yomtov Rishon, v'Oichlo B'Sheni. We're not going to go into that case, but that's a case about Trumas and Maestros. It's quite complicated. V'chein Beitzah Shenolda B'Rishon, and similarly, an egg that was born on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, Toichel B'Sheni. You're allowed to eat this egg on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. B'Sheni an egg that was born on the first day of Rosh Hashanah is permitted to eat on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. But B'Rishon Loi, and this egg that was born on the first day of Rosh Hashanah is not allowed to be eaten. So clearly we see that if you have an egg that's laid by a chicken and you're going to eat this chicken, nonetheless, the chicken you're allowed to eat, but the egg you're not allowed to eat. Very good. Andy, you're 2 ahead of the game. I'm 2 ahead of the game. Very good. But before we get to Andy's answer, we're just going to understand this contradiction. On the one hand, we've said that an apple that you're trying to eat, juices that come out of it, Rabbi Yehuda said you're allowed to drink those juices. On the flip side, a chicken that you're planning to eat, if it lays an egg, you're not allowed to eat that egg. What's the difference? On the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda says juices from a fruit that you're going to eat are allowed, but eggs from a chicken that you're going to eat is not allowed. You understand that contradiction? Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating here is that he equates the chicken and the egg and the juices from the fruit. That's his whole contradiction. And in order to contradict each other, they must be talking about the same thing. So the way Rabbi Yochanan phrases this whole question of, I don't understand, on the one hand, fruit from juices from fruit, but on the flip side, chickens from egg, sees that he clearly understands that juices from a fruit and eggs from a chicken are part of the same problem. And this is exactly like Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding, that the whole problem around this egg is that you might come to eat juices from a fruit. And it is not like the Rabbi Yosef's understanding, which is that chickens' eggs are like apples that have fallen off trees. So clearly we see from here that Rabbi Yochanan is going with Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding, and that chickens that lay eggs are much like apples that give off juices. Umeshani Rabbi Yochanan, and we're just going to go through this contradiction when just Rabbi Yochanan gives an answer to this apparent contradiction that he has only come up with through understanding like Rabbi Yitzchak. And he says, Muchlefes hashita. So just rearrange the opinions in the first Mishnah, and really, as we know, the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, got very corrupted and distorted over time. And it seems to me there's been a printing mistake that's crept in. And in order to resolve this contradiction, we're just going to flip the opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim in the first Mishnah, and you're going to end up with Rabbi Yehuda being consistent. So we're just going to flip around the name tags basically on each opinion, and we're going to get around it that way. But the Gemara finishes off. From the fact that Rabbi Yochanan understands, or the fact that he creates a contradiction between chickens laying eggs and fruit giving off juices, Shema Minah Chad Tamahu. So we understand that he sees them as one and the same, and that is exactly like Rabbi Yitzchak. So just to go through what we've got so far, we had 4 answers or 4 suggestions as to what this dispute Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel could be about a chicken that lays an egg on Yom Tov. We had Renachon who said it was muktzah. We had Rabbi who says it was preparation, one day to the next. We had Rabbi Yosef who says it's a decree lest one comes to eat apples that have fallen off trees and then come to pick apples themselves. We had Rabbi Yitzchak who said that it's a prohibition of juices that come out of fruits, and we understand that Rabbi Yochanan is like Rabbi Yitzchak, and that he also understands it's a prohibition against maybe coming to squeeze fruit for their juices. Ravina Omar. So we've actually turned the page now in my one, Gimel on the top of Gimel on the base. This should be page 3B1, the last page of the booklet. Ravina Omar la'ilam leitepach. He doesn't agree with this whole flipping around of the name tags in the Mishnah to resolve this contradiction. And Rabbi Yehuda, he's not saying his own opinion. He's going with the logic of the rabbis and the opposing opinion, and he's just saying, really, according to me, Rabbi Yehuda, I don't mind if a chicken lays an egg on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and you can eat that egg, you can eat that chicken, it's all fine. I have no issue personally with that, because again, he understands that just like you can eat the chicken, you can eat the egg, and just like you can eat the apple, you can eat the juice. But he's just saying, even according to the stringent opinion that would forbid you from eating the egg on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, they would allow you to eat the egg on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Because he said it must be that they're considered 2 separate Yom Tovs. For Amilei Rabbanon, and the Rabbanon say, Loi Kedusha Achasi. The Rabbanon understand that no, it's really one long Yom Tov. Now, what this is talking about here is, let's say you have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So the question is, do you consider those 2 days of Rosh Hashanah 2 separate Yom Tovs or one long one? So Rabbi Yehuda says it must be you see them as 2 separate Yom Tovs, which means if you have an egg born on the first day, by the time it comes to the second day, there's only really one day which can be Yom Tov, meaning Rabbi Yehuda understands Rosh Hashanah only really has 1 day. Just to cover our bases, we're going to have 2 days to make sure we don't miss it. So there's only really 1 day of Rosh Hashanah. If this egg was born on the first day, well, if that was Rosh Hashanah, then today isn't. Right? There's only 1 day of Rosh Hashanah. So if day 1 was Rosh Hashanah, then by the time it comes to the second day, that's not Rosh Hashanah anymore. And if day 1 wasn't Rosh Hashanah, and today is Rosh Hashanah, well, what's the problem? It was born.
They used to argue also for error.
Yeah, 100%. We see this a lot of the time. In the case that I missed out, we also see this. It's a case where it's called al-tanai, it's on condition, and you play your cards that way. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, according to my understanding, if the egg was born on the first day, there should be no issue with having it on the second day, because only one of them can be Rosh Hashanah. The Rabbanon disagree with that, and as Andy quite rightly said, they say, no, it's considered one long Yom Tov. And Rosh Hashanah is the only Yom Tov we potentially say this for, and we're going to say that no, it's not really two separate days. It's all considered Rosh Hashanah. All of it's Rosh Hashanah. So even though it was born yesterday, this egg, even though it was laid yesterday, that's considered like it was laid on the morning of Rosh Hashanah, and now we're just later on in that very same Yom Tov. So it was essentially born on Rosh Hashanah, even though it was technically laid a calendar day apart. But this is considered one long day.
If you read one of these Gemaras and one of these rabbinical answers, are you going to have to choose which one you go with?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. The answer is no. And it's all really thanks to the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. I'm going to get back to this in a second. This is a very interesting point. Yeah, let me just finish this. Ravina Bereid Rav Ula Omar, we're just coming to another way to resolve this apparent contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda's statement. That this case of this egg that was laid on Rosh Hashanah refers to a chicken that was brought to lay eggs. Rabbi Yehuda mukta, and he goes according to his rationale that it's going to be mukta. So really, the two cases that we use to contradict each other of the egg and the chicken and the juices and the fruit aren't really comparable. One case is forbidden because of mukta, that's the egg and the chicken, and one case is permitted, that's the fruit and the juices, because it's just two basically foods, or the same food being divided into two. So that would be okay. So just a very quick recap, and we'll get the food out. We had a apparent contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda, which was that on the one hand, he says you can eat juices from an apple you're intending to eat. On the other hand, you can't have eggs from a chicken that you're intending to eat. What is the difference? Answer number one is just flip it around. He never actually said that. It's a printing mistake. Answer number two was that, answer number two, sorry, was that Rabbi Yehuda isn't really professing his own view. He's just saying what the Rabbon, what other people would say. That itself is challenged for a reason. And the third answer is that really this is talking about mukta, and one case is talking about mukta, which is going to be a problem, and the other case is just talking about food separating itself into two parts, which is going to be allowed. So we're going to wrap up the Gemara part of this, and thank you for joining, and thank you again to our sponsor for dedicating this in memory of Rabbi Yerucham ben Moshe, Jeremy Cass.